Katie Morgan gripped the controls of her fighter ship as explosions bloomed across the darkness of space like deadly flowers, and her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, and the battle for Kepler Station had gone sideways fast. The enemy had come out of nowhere with twice as many ships as intelligence predicted, and now the human fleet was scattered and desperate. And Katie pulled her fighter into a sharp dive to avoid incoming fire, and her targeting computer screamed warnings that she barely heard over the chaos. Through her cockpit window she could see the station burning and people were still trapped inside, and the evacuation ships were sitting ducks, and her squadron was supposed to provide cover, but they were outnumbered, 3-1. Her communication system crackled and Zareth's voice came through calm despite everything, and he said something in his language that his translator rendered as "Stay close, sister." And Katie felt a small comfort, because if she was going to die today at least, her best friend was here. Zareth flew a Valerian interceptor that moved like liquid silver through space, and his two dragons, Ember and Ash, were secured in the special compartment behind his seat, and Katie had always thought it was strange that he brought them into combat. But Valerians believed dragons brought luck and protection. They had been friends for 5 years, ever since the first human diplomatic mission to Thesara, and Zareth had been assigned as their military liaison, and Katie remembered thinking he looked exactly like the elves from old Earth fantasy stories with his silver hair and pointed ears and glowing golden eyes. But he was real, and he was funny, and he hated military coffee as much as she did. And they bonded over long nights on patrol duty, complaining about their commanding officers and playing cards and teaching each other about their worlds. Zareth had taught her some Valerian flying techniques that human pilots never learned, and she had taught him earth poker and how to curse properly in English, and they became the kind of friends who could communicate with just a look across a briefing room. And now they were fighting for their lives, and Katie saw 3 enemy fighters break formation and head straight for the evacuation ships, and she banked hard to intercept, but her weapons were nearly depleted, and she knew she could maybe take out one before the others got through. Zareth saw it too, and his ship surged forward, faster than hers could manage, and he took out the first enemy fighter with a precise shot that made it look easy. And Katie went after the second, and her lasers found their mark, and the ship exploded in a shower of debris. But the third fighter had gotten past them, and it was lining up a shot on the largest evacuation ship, which was packed with over 200 civilians, and Katie pushed her engine to maximum, but she was too far away, and time seemed to slow down as she watched the enemy weapons charge. Then Zareth's ship flashed past her so fast she barely saw it, and he put himself directly between the enemy and the evacuation ship, and Katie screamed into her communicator for him to move, but he did not move. The enemy fired, and Zareth's shields took the first hit and the second and the third, but on the fourth shot his shields collapsed and the plasma cannon struck his ship. Dead center. Katie saw the flash of purple light that meant a Valerian ship core breach, and she knew what that meant, and her scream caught in her throat as Zareth's fighter exploded into 1,000 glittering pieces. The enemy fighter that killed him lasted 3 more seconds before Katie blew it apart with every weapon she had left, and she was crying and cursing, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the controls. The battle ended 20 minutes later when reinforcements finally arrived, and the enemy retreated, and Katie landed her fighter on the station deck and sat in the cockpit for a long time staring at nothing. When she finally climbed out, her commanding officer was waiting, and his face was grave, and he told her that Zareth had saved over 200 lives with his sacrifice, and that he would receive the highest military honors from both Earth and Valerian governments. Katie nodded, but she could not speak because her best friend was gone, and all she could see was that purple flash burning behind her eyes. The funeral was held on Thesara 3 weeks later, and Katie stood in the forest clearing wearing her dress uniform while Valerian priests sang songs in their language and burned sacred herbs that smelled like cinnamon, and Rain Zareth family was there, and his parents stood tall and dignified in their mourning robes, and his widow Lyria was beautiful and devastated, and she had not looked at Katie once during the ceremony. Katie had only met Lyria twice before at brief social events, and they had barely spoken, and now Katie felt like an intruder at this intimate family grief. The dragons Ember and Ash sat on a special perch near the funeral pyre, and they had not eaten since Zareth's death. And Valerian custom said that bonded dragons often died of grief within days of losing their keeper after The ceremony, Katie approached Zareth's parents to offer her condolences, and his mother took her hands and said in careful English that Zareth had spoken of her often and with great love, and that she was honored to meet his bond sister. Katie did not know what bond sister meant exactly, but she nodded and thanked her and tried not to cry again. She returned to Earth the next day and tried to go back to normal life, but everything felt hollow and wrong, and she kept expecting to hear Zareth's voice on her communicator making some joke about the terrible coffee in the officer mess. 2 months passed in a gray fog, and Katie went through the motions of her duties, but her heart was not in it, and her commander suggested she take some leave and figure out what she wanted to do next. She was sitting in her apartment in Denver drinking coffee and staring at nothing, when her door chimed and she opened it to find 3 Valerian officials in formal robes standing in the hallway. The lead official introduced himself as Theron and asked if they could come inside to discuss a matter of great importance regarding Zareth's estate. Katie let them in because she assumed they needed some kind of statement or paperwork for military records, and she offered them seats in her small living room. Theron pulled out a data tablet and his expression was serious, and he said that according to Valerian law, Zareth had named Katie as his primary inheritor, and she laughed because she thought he meant maybe some personal effects or his lucky flight jacket. But Theron did not smile, and he explained that Zareth had left her everything, and when Katie asked what everything meant, the official began reading from the tablet, the family estate on Thessera, which included 200 acres of forest and a main house built into an ancient tree, and 4 smaller buildings, and the dragon breeding grounds, his military pension, which was substantial, and would continue paying out for the next 30 years, his seat on the Planetary Council, which carried voting rights on matters of planetary defense and trade, his collection of ancient Valerian texts and art, which was worth a fortune, and his widow Lyria, who was now legally Katie's responsibility. Under Valerian marriage law, Katie stared at the official and her brain could not process what she was hearing, and she asked him to repeat that last part. Theron repeated himself slowly and carefully, and explained that Valerian marriage bonds were sacred contracts that did not end with death, and when a bonded Valerian died without children, their spouse and all their holdings transferred to their closest chosen family. Katie asked what chosen family meant, and Theron said it meant whoever the deceased had named as their bond sibling, and apparently Zareth had filed those papers 4 years ago naming Katie as his bond sister. She had no memory of this, and Theron explained that Zareth likely did it quietly, because humans often did not understand the legal weight of Valerian family bonds, and he probably did not want to make things awkward, but now it meant that Katie was legally responsible for everything Zareth owned, including his widow, and Theron said the word widow like it was the most normal thing in the world. Katie stood up and walked to her window and looked out at the Denver skyline and tried to make sense of this, and she asked what happened if she refused the inheritance. The other 2 Valerian officials shifted uncomfortably, and Theron explained that refusing would be seen as a grave insult to Zareth's memory and his entire family line, and it would suggest that Katie did not value their friendship and that she rejected Valerian culture. It would also leave Lyria in a terrible position, because she would have no legal standing without a family bond, and she would lose everything and become essentially homeless, and the shame would follow her forever. Katie felt trapped and angry and confused, and she asked why Zareth would do this to her without asking, and Theron said gently that Zareth probably believed he would survive the war and have time to explain everything properly. He had not expected to die, and he certainly had not expected to die so young. And now Katie was stuck with consequences neither of them had planned for. She asked what being responsible for Lyria actually meant, and Theron explained that it meant Katie had to provide for her and protect her interests and make decisions about the estate and maintain the family honor. It did not mean they had to live together or even like each other, but it did mean Katie had legal and social obligations that she could not ignore. Katie sat back down and put her head in her hands and thought about Zareth and how he had always been impulsive and optimistic, and how he probably thought he was doing something kind by making sure his family would be taken care of. But he had also stuck Katie with a responsibility she never asked for and did not know how to handle. Theron waited patiently, and finally Katie asked what Lyria thought about all this and whether she even wanted some random human managing her life. The official said that Lyria was grieving and struggling, but she understood Valerian law, and she had accepted the situation, and she was waiting on Thessera to meet Katie properly. Katie felt a surge of guilt, because she had barely thought about Lyria in the week since the funeral, and she had been so wrapped up in her own grief that she forgot Zareth widow had lost even more. She asked how long she had to decide, and Theron said she had already kept them waiting 2 months, and the family was getting anxious, and if she was going to accept, she needed to come to Thessera soon. Katie thought about her empty apartment and her gray fog life, and her commander suggesting she take leave, and she realized she had nothing keeping her on Earth except fear. She asked what would happen to Zareth dragons and Theron. Face softened, and he said that Ember and Ash were dying slowly, because bonded dragons could not survive without their keeper unless they bonded to someone new. They had been refusing food and growing weaker, and the only person they had shown any interest in was Katie, because Zareth had spent 5 years teaching them to trust her. If Katie did not come soon, the dragons would die, and that would be another tragedy on top of everything else. That decided it, because Katie could not let Zareth dragons die because she was scared, and she told Theron she would accept the inheritance and come to Thessera. The official looked relieved and pulled out more papers for her to sign and explained that a transport ship would be ready in 3 days and she should pack for an extended stay. After they left, Katie sat in her apartment and stared at the pile of documents and wondered what she had just agreed to. She called her commander the next morning and requested an indefinite leave of absence and explained the situation, and he was surprisingly understanding and told her the military would hold her position for up to 2 years if she needed it. She spent 2 days packing and researching Valerian culture and learning phrases in their language and trying not to panic about meeting Lyria. The transport ship was comfortable, but the journey took 2 weeks, and Katie spent most of it reading everything she could find about Valerian marriage customs and inheritance law and dragon breeding. She learned that Valerians bonded for life, and that their marriages were considered sacred contracts blessed by their gods, and that breaking a family bond was one of the worst things a Valerian could do. She learned that dragon keepers were highly respected, and that the bond between keeper and dragon was considered almost as sacred as marriage, and that Zareth family had been breeding dragons for over 300 years. She learned that estate management was complex and involved maintaining the grounds and managing breeding contracts and attending council meetings and participating in community events. By the time the ship approached Thessera, Katie felt completely overwhelmed and unprepared. The planet was beautiful, and Katie pressed her face to the viewing window and stared at the massive trees that covered the surface and the purple sky and the silver cities built into the canopy. The landing pad was in the northern forest, and when Katie stepped off the ship, the air smelled like honey and rain, and something else she could not name. A group of Valerians was waiting, and Katie recognized some of them from the funeral, and they were all dressed in formal robes and watching her with expressions that ranged from curious to suspicious. A tall Valerian male stepped forward and introduced himself as Theron's younger brother, and said he would escort her to the estate. Katie followed him to a transport vehicle that hovered a few feet off the ground, and they flew through the forest following paths between the massive trees. The estate appeared suddenly, and Katie gasped because it was bigger than she expected, and the main house was built into a tree so large it made earth redwoods look like saplings. The house seemed to grow out of the tree itself, with walls of living wood and windows that glowed with soft light and bridges connecting different levels. Theron landed the vehicle and told Katie that the family was waiting inside and that she should be respectful and patient because this was difficult for everyone. Katie nodded and grabbed her bags and followed him up a winding staircase carved into the tree trunk. The main hall was vast and beautiful, with high ceilings and furniture made from carved wood and woven fabrics in shades of blue and silver. Dozens of Valerians stood waiting, and they all turned to look at Katie when she entered, and the room fell silent. Then, a door at the far end opened and Lyria walked in. She was tall and elegant and beautiful in a way that made Katie feel clumsy and plain, and she wore traditional robes of deep blue that marked her as a widow. Her silver hair was braided with golden thread, and her eyes were the same glowing gold as Zareth, but hers held an ocean of grief. Lyria stopped a few feet from Katie and studied her for a long moment, and Katie did not know what to do or say. Then Lyria stepped forward and placed both hands on Katie's shoulders in what Katie would later learn was a traditional greeting between family members. Lyria spoke in careful English and said that Zareth had told her much about his human sister, and that she was grateful Katie had come. Katie did not know what to say, so she just nodded and tried not to cry, because seeing Lyria made Zareth's death feel real in a way it had not before. And this was his widow, and Katie was supposed to take care of her. Somehow, Lyria seemed to understand, and she squeezed Katie's shoulders once before stepping back and gesturing to the assembled family, and she introduced them one by one in a mix of Valerian and English. There were aunts and uncles and cousins and more distant relatives, and Katie tried to remember names, but there were too many, and they all looked at her with expressions she could not read. Zareth's parents stepped forward, and his mother embraced Katie and said, "Welcome home, daughter." And Katie felt something break inside her chest, because she had not expected that warmth. His father was more reserved, but he shook her hand in the human style, and told her that any friend of Zareth was family, and that they would help her learn their ways. Theron showed Katie to a guest house at the edge of the estate grounds and explained that this would be her residence for now, and that Lyria lived in the main house and they could decide later if other arrangements made more sense. The guest house was small, but beautiful, with 2 rooms and a bathroom and a small kitchen and windows that looked out over the forest, and Katie unpacked her few belongings and felt very alone. That evening, there was a formal dinner in the main hall, and Katie wore the nicest clothes she had packed, and tried not to feel underdressed compared to the Valerians in their flowing robes. She was seated next to Lyria at the long table, and the food was strange but delicious, and Katie tried everything even though she did not know what most of it was. The family spoke mostly in Valerian but occasionally switched to English for Katie's benefit, and they asked her questions about Earth and her military service, and her friendship with Zareth. Katie told them stories and watched Lyria face as she described the poker games and the terrible coffee and the long patrol shifts where they would talk about everything and nothing. Lyria smiled a few times, and once she laughed, and it was a sad, broken sound. But it was something. After dinner, Theron took Katie to see the dragons, and they walked through the forest to a clearing where several small buildings housed the breeding operation. Ember and Ash were in a special enclosure, and when they saw Katie, they lifted their heads and made soft chirping sounds. That broke her heart. They looked terrible, and their scales were dull and their eyes were dim, and they had clearly lost weight. Katie knelt down and reached through the bars, and they pressed their heads against her hands, and she felt tears run down her face. Theron explained that dragons bonded through touch and trust and time, and that Katie needed to spend several hours each day with them if she wanted them to accept her as their new keeper. He also said that she needed to feed them herself and sleep near them for the first few weeks and speak to them constantly, so they learned her voice. It sounded exhausting, but Katie agreed because she owed Zareth this much at least. She spent that first night in a small room attached to the dragon enclosure, and Ember and Ash watched her through the bars and occasionally made soft sounds. Katie talked to them about Zareth and about Earth and about how scared she was, and they seemed to listen. The next morning, Lyria brought her breakfast and found her sitting on the floor with the dragons pressed against the bars as close to Katie as they could get. Lyria said this was a good sign, and that the dragons remembered Katie from all the times Zareth had brought them to visit her. She also said that if Katie succeeded in bonding with them, it would mean a lot to the family, because it would prove that Zareth's judgment had been sound. Katie had not thought about it that way, but she realized that everything she did here would reflect on Zareth and his choices. The first week was overwhelming, and Katie spent her days learning the estate operations and her nights with the dragons, and she fell into bed exhausted every evening. Theron taught her about the dragon breeding program and showed her records going back generations and explained which bloodlines were most valuable and which dragons were ready to be sold and which needed more training. Katie met the staff who maintained the grounds and cared for the dragons, and they were polite but distant, and she could tell they were waiting to see if she would stay or run. She attended her first council meeting and sat in Zareth's seat and listened to debates about trade agreements and defense protocols, and tried to follow along. The other council members were curious about her, and some were welcoming, but others clearly thought a human had no business on a Valerian council. Katie bit her tongue and stayed quiet and took notes and tried to learn. Lyria was distant but not unkind, and she showed Katie around the estate and explained family traditions and corrected her when she made cultural mistakes. Katie learned that Valerians valued directness, but also formality, and that there were rules about who could touch, whom and how and when. She learned that refusing food was an insult and that eye contact during serious conversations was mandatory, and that asking about someone's family was the highest form of respect. She also learned that Lyria woke up crying most nights and that she spent hours in the garden where Zareth had proposed to her, and that she wore her mourning robes. Even though the formal mourning period had ended, Katie wanted to help, but did not know how. And every time she tried to talk to Lyria about Zareth, the conversation would falter and die. 3 weeks after Katie arrived, Ember and Ash finally ate from her hand, and it felt like a victory. The dragons were still weak, but they were improving, and they had started responding to her voice commands and following her around the enclosure. Theron said it was time to let them out and let them fly, and Katie was terrified because she had never handled dragons before. But Lyria offered to help, and she showed Katie the proper commands, and how to read dragon body language and how to reward them when they obeyed. They took the dragons to an open field, and Lyria demonstrated with one of the other estate dragons, and then Katie tried with Ember. The dragon looked at her with intelligent eyes and then launched into the air, and Katie felt a surge of joy as she watched him circle above her. Ash followed, and soon both dragons were flying together and playing, and Katie could see their strength returning. Lyria stood beside her and watched, and after a moment she said quietly that Zareth would be happy to see this. Katie said she wished he could be here, and Lyria nodded, and they stood in silence watching the dragons. That night Katie found Lyria crying in the garden, and instead of walking away, she sat down beside her on the stone bench. Lyria did not tell her to leave, so Katie stayed, and after a long time Lyria started talking. She talked about meeting Zareth when they were young, and how he had been so full of life, and how he made her laugh even when she wanted to be serious. She talked about their bonding ceremony and their plans to have children and grow old together. She talked about the day she learned he had died, and how the world had stopped making sense. Katie listened, and did not try to fix anything, and when Lyria leaned her head on her shoulder, Katie let her. They sat like that until the moons rose and the garden filled with silver light, and Katie realized this was the first real conversation they had had after. That night something shifted, and Lyria started seeking Katie out, and they began having meals together and talking about Zareth. Katie shared her own stories, and Lyria laughed at the ones about poker and cried at the ones about patrol duty. And slowly, they built something fragile between them. The dragons continued to improve, and by the end of the second month they were flying regularly and had bonded fully to Katie. The family noticed, and their attitudes began to soften, and Zareth's mother told Katie she had done well and that she was proud of her. Katie started to feel less like an intruder and more like someone who might actually belong here. She learned to navigate council meetings and made her first proposal about increasing trade with human colonies, and it passed by a narrow vote. She learned to manage the estate finances and discovered she was actually good at it. She learned Valerian history and customs, and began to understand the weight of the family legacy she had inherited, and slowly the gray fog that had surrounded her since Zareth's death began to lift, and she started to feel like herself again. 3 months into her stay on Thessara, Katie woke up and realized she had not thought about leaving in over a week, and the guest house had started to feel like home, rather than temporary shelter. The dragons had grown significantly, and their scales now gleamed with health, and they followed her everywhere and slept. Curled up outside her door, Ember had developed a habit of stealing her boots and hiding them in trees, and Ash liked to sing in the mornings, which meant making a warbling sound that was actually quite beautiful. Katie had learned to fly with them the way Zareth used to, and she would climb onto Ember's back and they would soar over the forest, and she felt closer to her friend in those moments than anywhere else. The estate operations were running smoothly, and Katie had proven herself capable of managing the breeding program, and she had successfully negotiated 3 major sales to other Valerian families. The council had grudgingly accepted her presence, and she had made allies with some of the younger members who were interested in strengthening ties with humanity. But it was her relationship with Lyria that had changed the most, and what had started as awkward obligation had become genuine friendship. They had dinner together most evenings now, and they would talk about their days and share stories and sometimes just sit in comfortable silence. Lyria had started teaching Katie the Valerian language properly, and Katie was teaching Lyria about Earth, culture, and they laughed at each other's mistakes one evening. Lyria asked Katie to help her sort through Zareth's belongings, and they spent hours going through his things, and Lyria told stories about each item. There was his flight jacket that smelled like him, and his collection of terrible human coffee that he had hoarded, and his journals filled with drawings of dragons and battle tactics. Katie found a letter addressed to her tucked into one of the journals, and her hands shook as she opened. The letter was dated 3 days before the battle, and in it Zareth apologized for any burden his legal arrangements might cause, and explained that he trusted Katie more than anyone to protect what he loved. He wrote that Lyria was the strongest person he knew, but that she would need support, and that Katie would understand her in ways his family could not. He also wrote that the dragons would only bond to someone with a good heart, and that if they accepted Katie, it would prove what he already knew. The letter ended with a joke about poker and a reminder to never drink Valerian wine on an empty stomach, and Katie cried while Lyria held her. After that night they grew even closer, and Katie started spending more time in the main house and less in the guest house. The family had fully accepted her now, and Zareth's mother had started calling her daughter without the awkward pauses. His father asked her advice on council matters, and his younger cousins followed her around asking questions about Earth and human technology. Katie realized she was building a life here that felt real and meaningful, and she was happier than she had been in years. But there were complications too, and the biggest one was that Valerian society expected certain things from her and Lyria relationship that Katie did not fully understand. She noticed the way some family members watched them together, and the meaningful looks exchanged between aunts and uncles one day. Theron pulled her aside and explained carefully that in Valerian culture, a widow who was bonded to a new family head often became romantically involved with that person. It was not required, but it was common, and it was seen as a way of honoring the deceased by keeping the family unit intact. Katie felt her face burn and said that she and Lyria were just friends, and Theron nodded but said that feelings could change and she should be aware of expectations. That conversation made everything awkward for a week, and Katie suddenly noticed things she had been blind to before. The way Lyria touched her arm when they talked, and the way she smiled at Katie in a way that was different from how she smiled at others. The way the family seated them together at every meal and invited them as a pair to social events. Katie did not know what to do with this information because her feelings were complicated and confusing. She cared about Lyria deeply and found her beautiful and compelling, but she also felt like getting involved romantically would be taking advantage or dishonoring Zareth somehow. She avoided the issue by throwing herself into work and spent long hours with the dragons and on council business. But Lyria noticed, and one evening she asked Katie directly if she had done something wrong. Katie said no, and then tried to explain her confusion and her worry about expectations and her fear of making everything worse. Lyria listened, and then said something that surprised Katie, which was that she had feelings too, and they were equally confusing. She said that grief was strange and that she still loved Zareth and always would, but that she also felt drawn to Katie in ways she had not expected. She said she did not know what it meant and was not asking for anything, but she wanted Katie to know that whatever was happening was mutual. They agreed to take things slowly and not put pressure on whatever was developing between them, and Katie felt relieved, but also more confused than ever. The next few weeks were strange and charged, with tension that had not been there before. They still spent time together, but now Katie was hyper-aware of every touch and look, and her heart would race when Lyria laughed at her jokes. The family seemed pleased by whatever they thought was happening, and Zareth's mother made comments about how happy she was to see them both healing. Then a crisis hit that forced everything else into the background. Rival dragon breeding family challenged the estate legal right to a particular bloodline and demanded either payment or the return of 3 adult dragons. It was a serious claim, and if they lost, it would damage the family reputation and cost them a fortune. Katie threw herself into research and discovered that the original breeding contract had been mishandled 2 generations ago, and there was a legitimate dispute. She spent days in the family archives reading old documents and learning about Valerian contract law, and she barely slept. Lyria worked alongside her, and together they built a case, that the contract, while flawed, had been honored in good faith, and that the current generation should not be punished for old mistakes. They presented their findings to the council, and Katie spoke for over an hour defending the estate position and citing precedents and appealing to Valerian values of fairness and family honor. The council deliberated for 2 days, and Katie could not eat or sleep, and she paced the estate grounds while Ember and Ash tried to comfort her. Finally, the decision came down in their favor, and the rival family claim was dismissed, and the estate reputation was intact. The family celebrated, and Zareth's father embraced Katie and said she had proven herself a true member of their line. That night there was a feast, and Katie drank too much Valerian wine despite Zareth's warning in his letter, and Lyria had to help her back to the guest house. They were both laughing, and Katie was saying something about how Zareth would have found this funny, and then suddenly, they were kissing. It was not planned, and it was clumsy and tasted like wine, but it felt right in a way that scared Katie. They pulled apart and stared at each other, and Katie started to apologize, but Lyria stopped her and said she had been wanting to do that for weeks. They talked until dawn about Zareth and grief and guilt and whether they were dishonoring his memory or honoring it by finding happiness together. Lyria said that Zareth would want them both to be happy, and that he had trusted Katie because he knew she would take care of Lyria in all ways. Katie said she was terrified of getting this wrong, and of hurting Lyria more than she already hurt. Lyria said fear was reasonable, but that they could figure this out together, if Katie was willing to try. Katie said yes, and they held hands and watched the sunrise through the trees. The relationship developed slowly after that, and they were careful not to rush and to check in with each other constantly. The family was delighted and treated it as the most natural thing in the world. Katie still struggled with guilt sometimes, but Lyria reminded her that Zareth had given them both to each other on purpose. 5 months after arriving on Thesara, Katie officially moved into the main house and took up residence in the family wing. The Valerian High Council recognized her as full member of Zareth family line with all rights and responsibilities. She was no longer just managing an inheritance, but building a life that was truly hers. 8 months after arriving on Thesara, Katie stood on the balcony of the main house watching Ember and Ash practice aerial maneuvers over the forest, and she realized she could not remember the last time she had thought about going back to Earth. The dragons were fully grown now and magnificent, and they had become famous across Thesara for their intelligence and beauty, and several families had requested breeding contracts. Katie had learned to speak Valerian fluently, though she still made grammatical mistakes that made Lyria laugh, and she had mastered the complex etiquette of Valerian high society. She served on the Planetary Council with confidence now, and had become known as a voice for practical solutions and bridge building between human and Valerian interests. Just last week, she had brokered a major trade agreement that would benefit both species, and the Council had thanked her formally for her service. The estate was thriving, and the dragon breeding program was more successful than it had been in years, and they had just welcomed a new clutch of eggs that would hatch in 3 months. Katie had proven herself not just as a manager, but as an innovator, and she had introduced some human organizational techniques that improved efficiency while respecting Valerian traditions. But it was her personal life that had changed most dramatically, and in ways she never could have imagined. She and Lyria had grown from awkward strangers to friends to something deeper and more complex, and now they shared a life that felt both new and inevitable. They had their own rhythms and routines and inside jokes, and they had learned each other, quirks and boundaries. Lyria still had hard days when grief would hit her like a wave and she would need space to cry and remember, and Katie had learned to give her that space while staying close enough to help. Katie still dreamed sometimes of the purple flash of Zareth's ship exploding, and would wake up gasping, and Lyria would hold her until the panic passed. They talked about Zareth often and kept his memory alive, and Katie had learned that loving Lyria did not mean betraying her friend. In fact, she had come to believe that this was exactly what Zareth had hoped. For when he made his legal arrangements, he had known them both well enough to see what they could become together, and he had trusted them to figure it out. The family had fully embraced their relationship and treated Katie as Zareth's parents' daughter-in-law, which still felt strange but also wonderful. They had started asking when Katie and Lyria would have a bonding ceremony and make their relationship official in Valerian eyes. Katie and Lyria talked about it often, and both wanted it, but They also wanted to do it right and honor both Valerian and human traditions. They were planning a ceremony for next spring that would blend elements from both cultures, and Katie's mother was going to come from Earth to attend. Katie had visited Earth once, during these 8 months for 2 weeks, and it had felt alien and wrong, and she had been homesick for Thessara the entire time. Her military commander had offered to reinstate her, and she had resigned instead and formally requested transfer to the Valerian Defense Liaison Program. She would still work with the human military, but as a cultural bridge and advisor, rather than an active pilot. It felt right, and it let her keep ties to both worlds while making Thessara her home. The dragons had bonded to her completely, and now they were an extension of her in ways she could not fully explain. She could sense their moods, and they responded to her thoughts as much as her voice commands. And when she flew with them, she felt Zareth's presence, like he was flying alongside them. Ember had become protective and possessive and growled at anyone who got too close to Katie. Ash was gentler and liked to curl up with her when she read and would listen intently when she talked, as if understanding every word. The breeding program had brought in substantial income, and Katie had used some of it to establish a scholarship fund for young Valerians who wanted to study off-world. It was named after Zareth, and it would send 3 students per year to Earth or other human colonies to study and build connections. Zareth's parents had cried when she announced it, and his father said it was exactly the kind of thing Zareth would have done. Katie had also started teaching human combat tactics to Valerian defense forces and sharing knowledge that might save lives in future conflicts. She had written a manual that combined human and Valerian strategic thinking, and it was being adopted by military academies across both civilizations. The work felt meaningful, and it honored Zareth's sacrifice by helping prevent future losses. One evening, Katie and Lyria were in the garden where Zareth had proposed, and they were talking about their bonding ceremony plans. Lyria said she wanted to include a ritual where they would release 2 dragons into the sky as symbols of their bond, and Katie loved the idea. They talked about vows and music and guest lists and what food to serve, and it all felt real and exciting. Then Lyria grew quiet and said there was something she needed to tell Katie. She said that in Valerian culture, bonded pairs were expected to have children and carry on the family line. She said she wanted that, but she also knew Katie was human and might have different ideas about family. Katie thought about it and realized she did want children, and the idea of raising kids on Thessara with Lyria filled her with unexpected joy. Valerian technology allowed for children to be created from 2 mothers' genetics, and the process was well established and safe. They decided to wait until after the bonding ceremony, but they both wanted to start a family within a few years. Zareth's parents were thrilled when they heard, and his mother immediately started planning for grandchildren. The next council meeting, Katie proposed an initiative to increase human Valerian cultural exchange programs, and it passed unanimously. She had become respected enough that her proposals were taken seriously, and she had built genuine friendships with several council members. After the meeting, an elder counselor approached her and said he had been skeptical when she first arrived, but she had proven herself 10 times over. He said Zareth had chosen well, and that the family and the planet were lucky to have her. Katie thanked him and felt a swell of pride because she had worked hard to earn that respect. That night, she and Lyria hosted a dinner party for close friends and family, and Katie cooked human-style pasta, which the Valerians found strange but interesting. They laughed and told stories and played Valerian music, and Katie taught them a few Earth card games. It was loud and chaotic, and felt like home later. After everyone left, Katie and Lyria sat on the balcony under the stars and the moons, and Ember and Ash slept nearby. Lyria said she was happy, and Katie realized she was too. Not the simple happiness of having no problems, but the deeper happiness of building something meaningful with someone she loved. She thought about Zareth and felt gratitude, instead of just grief, because his sacrifice had given her all of this. He had saved her life in the battle, but he had also given her a future worth living, and a family worth protecting, and a purpose that mattered. Katie said out loud to the stars that she hoped he was proud of her, and Lyria squeezed her hand and said she knew he was. They sat in comfortable silence, and Katie thought about the journey from that terrible day over Kepler Station to this moment. She had been so lost and broken and angry, and now she was found and whole and at peace. The path had not been easy, and there had been pain and confusion and doubt, but she had walked it anyway. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped being just Katie Morgan, the pilot who lost, her best friend. She had become Katie Morgan, the Dragon Keeper and council member and partner and daughter and bridge between worlds. She had become someone Zareth would be proud to call sister, and someone Lyria could build a future with. She had become home. The next morning, Katie woke early and went to visit the dragon breeding grounds as she did every morning. The new eggs were doing well, and she checked on them carefully and made notes about their development. Then she took Ember and Ash out for their morning flight, and they soared over the forest as the purple sun rose. From high above Thesara, she could see the estate and the city beyond, and the vast forest stretching to the horizon. She could see the life she had built, and the future she was creating, and she felt nothing but gratitude. When she landed, Lyria was waiting with breakfast, and they ate together on the balcony and made plans for the day. It was ordinary and perfect, and exactly what Katie had never known she wanted. And as she looked at Lyria laughing at something Ember did, and felt the warm sun on her face and heard the sounds of the estate coming alive below, Katie understood what Zareth's final gift had really been. He had not just left her an inheritance. He had given her a chance to become the person she was always meant to be, and she had taken that chance and run with it, and built something beautiful from tragedy. She had built a home, not just a place, but a life, full of purpose and love and belonging, that was worth more than anything she had left behind.